Life in Chapelhay before the war. Prior to the outbreak of war, people from all over the UK flocked to Weymouth for their holidays. The area around Chapelhay itself was most famous for its brewery.
There were two breweries, in fact, in Weymouth, one by John Groves and the other one was Devonish, and they were sat side by side down in Hope Square. Now, in 1940, Devonish brewery was hit by a bomb, and the John Groves' brewery helped out by doing their brewing for them until the place was rebuilt. It's rather funny that the heads of both breweries were actually heavily into working for Holy Trinity Church, and one was the church warden and the other built a large hall in memory of his son who died young, a place called the Sydney Hall.
Everybody was connected to the brewery in the area. My father worked for the brewery, Groves' brewery, but then my grandparents was connected to Devenish's brewery, and my grandfather was the chauffeur of Major Devonish himself, which he worked for 52 years. And of course, it was argy-bargy in our houses. One house was Groves's and one house was Devenish's, so we had a little bit of friction between it all, you know. It meant an awful lot to people to be connected with the brewery. Proud, actually.
My father worked at the brewery, and so we had a brewery house. And when we first moved to Franchise Street, we went into number 8, and I was just a baby because my father had retired from the army. He was in the First World War as a prisoner of war, and he was in the Dorset Regiment, and he worked in the brewery. And he used to. My mother told me that he used to go in 7 days a week to turn the malt. And with the brewery, I can still smell the hops. I used to love to walk past the brewery and smell the hops. It was a lovely smell.
We used to have what they call the bottling girls, which used to bottle the beer. And in the mornings, you could hear when they was going to work. It was like living in Belgium. They all used to wear wooden clogs. And you could hear them walking all the way down Rodwood Avenue like a lot of penguins. Bang, 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 bang. You never hear nothing like it. But it was quite a few of them that worked in the brewery. It used to do all the bottling, these girls. And they everybody was connected with either Devenish's or Groves' brewery. I mean, that was the people's lives.
It was gradually got taken over and it closed down in 1985, which was a great loss. It was also a sort of paternalistic organisation where they have a large number of brewery allotments and houses for the workers. And a friend of mine who had the job of trying to be the resettlement officer for a recruitment company said that their people had worked for the firm 5 generations, and they knew no other life. And it was a great tragedy when it closed down.
From 1939 onwards, the town became a fortress, as day trippers were replaced by Allied forces and sandcastles by barbed wire. The 1930s were an especially significant time for the parish of Holy Trinity. Church historian Ivor Morgan writes, "Early in 1935, preparations were well in hand for the celebration of the centenary in the following year. The January 1935 parish magazine contains a very full account of the ceremonies observed at the laying of the foundation stone on the 1st of September 1834. The Reverend Clement M. Ricketts, vicar from 1924 to 1937, often wrote about important international affairs for the benefit of his parishioners. In 1935, he reprinted in full a sermon from the then Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple, foretelling the approach of war. All war is the devil's work, he says. If the nations that have devised the instruments of modern warfare are unable also to devise some method of adjusting their disputes without using those instruments upon one another, it will prove that they are not fit to handle them."
The church here is very much part of the community this side of the harbour, and in the context of Chapelhay, it is very much part of Chapelhay, and Chapelhay is above us. And although the church wasn't badly bombed during the war, it did affect our school. And the school, of course, in any community plays a huge part because a lot of the families and their children go to the school. And so it was the same in the Second World War. And certainly what the church, the part the church played was to try and keep things going as normally as possible, as most of the community. And the then vicar, Cecil Plaxton, a young priest who was well loved in the community for visiting people, with his curates, were very involved in the life of trying to keep things normal. And so, you know, the Boys Brigade and the Girl Guides and Brownies and all of those activities still continued during the war years to try and keep that kind of normality going.
The role of the church has been essentially the same for time immemorial. In times of tragedy, for example, the Second World War, priests were there to provide spiritual succour to those who were asking really difficult questions, like, for example, how is it that a 10-year-old boy praying for peace could die with his hands still clasped in prayer? And it was then the role of the priest to explain, well, it's not God who dropped those bombs, it's human beings. And another interesting role of the church during this time was of propaganda. And when you read contemporary vicars' letters in parish magazines, you find many of them mobilising in the manner of some of our most famous poets like W.H. Auden, and talking of righteous holy wars to justify the horrendous sacrifices being undertaken by our soldiers and those living here. And so they were essential in reminding people of the need to battle fascism in the way that we did.
Sadly, no copies of the parish magazine from 1937 survive. However, church historian Ivor Morgan recalls that they contained quotations from the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, Dr. Cosmo Gordon Lang and William Temple respectively, encouraging Christians to take a definite Christian stand against revived paganism. Also of concern is the upcoming abdication of King Edward VIII on account of his marriage to American divorcee Wallis Simpson. In 1937, Reverend Ricketts left to become canon missioner in the Gloucester diocese. His replacement, Reverend Cecil Andrew Plaxton, brought a new atmosphere to the parish, one of greater freedom and neighbourliness, a change from the previous academical feeling. Reverend Plaxton was a keen visitor who found that many people, while expressing a belief in God, had grown slack in their attendance at church services. Plaxton believed this was a sure sign of the total neglect of God, which he later attributed to the availability of counter-attractions like cinemas and coach trips.
Most of the activities which the clergy were involved with, and many of its organisations, took place in what was then called the Sydney Hall, which is was a huge Victorian edifice on the side of the parish, and concerts and choir evenings and all kinds of things happened in the Sydney Hall, much to the amusement of the American soldiers, who were very, very well loved around here. And certainly the church would have always been open during the war years for people to come in and to pray. And there is, in a magazine documented in January 1945, a special evensong that was held at Holy Trinity Church. And afterwards, the under-20s were meeting to discuss what they could put into the church building in memory of those who had lost their lives in the war.
In April 1938, Holy Trinity started using English hymnal instead of songs of praise. On Rogation Sunday that year, the clergy, choir, servers and congregation processed along to the Nothe for the blessing of crops and waters. For the first time in 80 years, thousands of mackerel were landed on the quay. Reynolds News called it the miracle of the mackerel. Reverend Plaxton responded, "We prayed on Rogation Day for rain and for peace. Since then, rain has fallen abundantly, and in a week the international situation has considerably eased." Sadly, the peace promised by Neville Chamberlain in November 1938 was not to last, and in September the following year, Weymouth resident Des Fry recalls how his mother wept as the Prime Minister made his declaration of war on the wireless.